The small-town diner was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's name, and the hum of conversation felt like a warm embrace. The soft clink of coffee cups and the gentle buzz of the overhead fan created an atmosphere of quiet comfort. On this particular afternoon, the usual calm was interrupted by a loud, boisterous man who walked in with an air of confidence. He was young, dressed in a bright, flashy shirt, and had an obnoxious grin plastered across his face as he swaggered over to a booth with his friends. The veteran, sitting at a corner table, hardly seemed to notice the intrusion. His eyes were fixed on the steam rising from his coffee cup, his face a roadmap of years filled with silent suffering and hard-earned wisdom. He was an older man, with hair gone gray and hands roughened by time, and the quiet dignity he carried was clear even in his silence. Every wrinkle on his face seemed to tell a story of sacrifices made, of battles fought, both on the front lines and in life. The young man's voice cut through the quiet hum of the diner, loud and mocking. He gestured towards the veteran, making sure everyone around him could hear his words. "What good is a washed-up soldier like you in today's world? You're just a has-been. No one cares about guys like you anymore." His friends snickered, some of them trying to stifle their laughter, but the man continued, enjoying the attention. "I bet your whole life has been one big mistake. What did you even do with your life? You're just a relic of the past." The veteran's fingers tightened around his coffee cup, the porcelain rim pressing against his skin. His knuckles turned white, betraying a flicker of emotion beneath his otherwise calm exterior. His gaze, however, was fixed on the window, his eyes distant and unfocused as though he were lost in a memory far away. The words of the young man, spiteful and cutting, seemed to wash over him like an old, familiar wound. He had heard these kinds of things before, not just from strangers, but from those who should have known better, those who should have respected him. But despite the anger brewing in him, he didn't respond. He simply stared out into the street, watching the world go by. The clinking of silverware and the murmur of conversations continued around him, but the veteran's mind was elsewhere. Perhaps he was reliving those moments in a war-torn land, or the silence of coming home, where the people who should have understood didn't. Across the diner, a few patrons couldn't help but glance nervously at the veteran. They exchanged uneasy looks, unsure of what to do. Some of them shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. A woman sitting at the counter turned her eyes back to her own coffee, but the look on her face was one of sympathy. She knew the old man had seen too much. She could feel the tension in the air, but she remained silent, just as the veteran did. The waitress, a young woman with a soft smile, kept glancing over at the veteran. Her gaze flickered back and forth between him and the table of young men. She could sense the tension, the bubbling anger threatening to surface, but she didn't know what to say. She was just a waitress, after all. She had seen the veteran come in time and time again, always quiet, always reserved. His presence was familiar, but she had never really spoken to him. As the mocking continued, the man at the table seemed to grow bolder. His words were loud and brash, meant for everyone in the diner to hear. "I bet you didn't do anything worth remembering," he sneered, taking a swig from his own drink, his eyes scanning the room as though daring anyone to contradict him. "You probably just followed orders and went home. I'm sure today's army doesn't need old men like you. You're just a piece of history, a useless relic." His friends snickered, feeding off his arrogance. One of them laughed so hard that a piece of bread flew from his mouth. The man didn't seem to care about the looks people were giving him. He was too focused on making the veteran the butt of his joke. "You probably never made a real difference, just another soldier who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Huh? What are you going to do now?" "Nothing, that's what." The veteran's grip on the cup tightened, and his jaw clenched slightly, though he still didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the window, as though the outside world, far removed from this petty scene, offered him some kind of peace. The rest of the diner stayed quiet, holding their breath, unsure if the veteran would finally snap. They could all feel it, the slow simmer of tension building in the air, but nobody moved to stop it. No one dared to intervene. The bustling sounds of the diner slowly faded as the veteran's mind drifted back in time, slipping into a memory from his youth. His fingers loosened around the coffee cup, but his mind was far from the present. He was once a young man, full of hope, and driven by a sense of duty that ran deep in his veins. His decision to enlist had come swiftly, no hesitation, no second thoughts. At the time he believed he was doing the right thing. He volunteered to serve his country, to fight for the freedoms he had been told to protect. The promise of brotherhood and unity was what called him. The memory brought a faint smile to his face, remembering the faces of the men who had become his family during that time. Their bonds had been stronger than blood, formed in the chaos of war, tested by fire and bloodshed. They were more than comrades, they were brothers. The laughter they shared in the rare moments of respite, the jokes and camaraderie, made the unbearable days just a bit easier to bear. They had each other's backs, no matter what, but war was never kind to anyone, and the memories weren't always filled with brotherly joy. The veteran's smile faded as the memory shifted, taking him back to a particular mission that had changed everything. The air was thick with smoke, and the acrid scent of gunpowder. The battlefield stretched out in front of them like an endless nightmare. He could still feel the heat of the sun beating down, the deafening sounds of gunfire, and the choking dust that clouded the air. His heart pounded in his chest as they moved through the wreckage, an uneasy sense of dread hanging over him. The mission had been tough, dangerous, even, but they had pushed forward, determined to succeed. It was supposed to be a simple operation, a few hours of work, but nothing in war was ever simple. The memory turned dark. The veteran felt the sudden sting of loss as he remembered his friends, the men who had stood by his side and fought bravely. The blast came out of nowhere, a sharp, blinding light that left his ears ringing and his body shaken. When the smoke cleared, he had seen the aftermath, bodies sprawled across the ground, faces frozen in shock, limbs twisted in unnatural angles. The pain of losing his brothers in arms was something he carried with him every day. The guilt too, the thought that maybe he could have done something differently, that maybe he could have saved them, was a weight he had never been able to shake. Even now, years later, the memory of that mission still haunted him. His friends had died doing something they believed in, something that had once made sense, but that didn't make their loss any easier. The veteran blinked back tears, fighting to keep his composure, but even with all the years and experiences that had followed, that mission still felt like a fresh wound. It was a wound that no amount of time could heal. As the memory faded, the veteran's thoughts shifted to his return home. He had come back to a world that seemed so disconnected from the one he had left. The streets were filled with people who had no idea what he had gone through, no understanding of the sacrifices he had made, or the trauma he carried inside. He had expected something different, a warm welcome, recognition for his service, gratitude from the people he had fought to protect. Instead, he found nothing but cold stares and condescending comments. People treated him as if he was broken, as if his service had made him somehow less. It was as if they saw him as a relic of a past they couldn't relate to or understand. The disrespect stung more than the wounds of battle ever had. He tried to explain, to reach out to those who might listen, but the isolation grew deeper. He had fought for a country that didn't seem to care for him. The veteran remembered retreating into the shadows, choosing solitude over rejection. He had learned that the world didn't want to hear about his pain, about the battles he had fought, not the ones in the field, but the ones inside himself. The weight of it all had made him retreat, pulling away from family, from friends, from everything he had once known. It had become easier to be alone, to shut out the world that had so quickly forgotten him. He came back from war, but in many ways he had never fully returned. He was still fighting, just not on a battlefield anyone could see. The veteran took a deep breath, his eyes momentarily closing as he gathered his thoughts. For a brief second, he felt the weight of the past, the loss, the anger and the years of unspoken grief. He had spent so much of his life keeping it all bottled up, but now, standing in the face of this brash young man, it felt like the right moment to finally speak up. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed himself out of the booth. The diner seemed to hold its breath as the sound of his worn boots hitting the floor filled the space. Every eye in the room was on him now, watching with a mixture of curiosity and tension. The once loud chatter of the diner had quieted, leaving only the soft clink of silverware and the quiet hum of the old fan overhead. The veteran didn't rush. His movements were slow, purposeful. He walked across the floor with the quiet authority of someone who had seen and done things that most people couldn't even begin to comprehend. With each step, the young man's mocking smile began to fade, replaced by uncertainty. His friends, once laughing, now shifted in their seats, unsure of what was happening. When the veteran finally reached the man's table, he stopped just a few feet away. The diner fell into a thick silence. There was no yelling, no dramatic confrontation. The veteran simply stood there, looking at the young man with eyes that had seen things no one should ever have to. His voice was steady, calm, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "You think you know what it's like to sacrifice for others, don't you?" the veteran asked quietly. "You have no idea what real courage is." His words cut through the arrogance of the young man's laughter like a knife. For a moment there was an uncomfortable stillness, a sense of awe in the air. The man opened his mouth to retort, but no sound came out. The force of the veteran's presence, his calm strength, seemed to have taken him off guard. The young man recovered quickly though, trying to regain his bravado. He let out a hollow laugh, and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms in defiance. "What are you gonna fight me? You're just an old man." His tone was dismissive, but it lacked the same confidence it had moments ago. There was a crack in the arrogance, a hint of fear starting to show in his eyes as he looked into the veteran's gaze. The veteran didn't flinch, he simply stood tall, unwavering, his calm demeanor, leaving the young man unsure of how to respond. The rest of the diner waited, holding their breath, uncertain of what would come next. The man opened his mouth, ready to throw another insult, but before he could speak, the diner's owner, a burly man in his 50s, stepped forward from behind the counter. His eyes were wide, and there was a look of disbelief on his face, as he looked between the veteran and the young man. The entire diner held its breath, unsure of what was about to happen. With a deep sigh, the owner cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the thick tension in the air. "You don't recognize him, do you?" he asked, his words carrying an edge of frustration and disbelief. The young man, still leaning back in his seat, looked at the owner with confusion in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" the man asked, clearly still not understanding the gravity of the situation. The owner's gaze never wavered from the young man as he continued. "This man you've been mocking, he's not just some washed-up soldier, he's one of the most decorated soldiers in our country." The diner went completely still, as the owner's words sank in. The young man's face slowly began to lose color. "What?" he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The owner nodded, his voice now firm with pride. "His bravery saved lives, including yours. You have no idea what you're talking about." He took a step closer to the veteran, his gaze softening. "This man didn't just fight for his country, he fought for all of us, and the price he paid, it's something you'll never understand." The words hit the young man like a thunderclap. His smug grin vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. The veteran wasn't just some has-been, he wasn't a relic of the past, nor a washed-up old man, he was a hero. The realization slammed into the young man like a wave, and for the first time, the weight of what he had done began to settle on his shoulders. As the truth sank in, the diner remained completely silent. Every patron in the room was watching, waiting for the young man's reaction. The veteran, standing tall and composed, said nothing, but his calm presence seemed to fill the room. He wasn't there to seek recognition or praise. He had already done his part. He didn't need validation from someone like this. The young man's face turned an ashen gray, and his arrogance was completely wiped away. His usual confident swagger melted into something much smaller, something closer to shame. He fumbled for words, but they wouldn't come. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but nothing intelligible escaped. "I didn't know," he stammered, his voice shaking. He glanced around the diner, the mocking words he had spewed earlier now echoing back at him like a cruel joke. The reality of the situation was dawning on him, and with it, the crushing weight of regret. The veteran stood there, unblinking, his expression unchanging. He hadn't moved an inch, and he hadn't said a word. His silence was more powerful than any words he could have spoken. The man had mocked a hero, and now he was left to face the consequences of his ignorance. The diner's atmosphere shifted. The tension that had filled the air moments before began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet reverence. The owner gave the veteran a nod of respect before turning to the young man, his gaze stern but not unkind. "Next time, before you open your mouth, maybe you should think about who you're talking to." The young man, completely humbled, didn't speak again. He slunk back into his seat, the weight of his own ignorance now fully on display for everyone to see. The veteran turned slowly, his boots clicking softly on the diner's floor as he made his way to the door. The silence in the room was thick, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. As he reached the door, he paused for a moment. His hand rested on the handle, but he didn't open it immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, casting one last glance over his shoulder at the young man who had mocked him. His voice was calm, almost wistful, as he spoke, but the weight of his words carried a sharp edge. "Karma has a funny way of working," he said quietly, his eyes locking with the young man's now humbled gaze. "I hope you find humility one day, son." With those final words, he opened the door and stepped out into the world beyond, leaving the diner behind in stunned silence. The door swung shut softly behind him, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the old fan. No one moved, no one spoke, and the young man sat there frozen in place, his mind reeling. The man's friends shifted awkwardly, unsure of what to say or how to break the thick, uncomfortable silence. The young man's bravado had evaporated, leaving behind only a hollow shell of the person he had been moments before. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found. Instead, he sat at the table, slumped in his chair, staring blankly ahead as though lost in his own thoughts. His arrogance had been shattered, replaced by a deep, crushing sense of shame. He had been so sure of himself, so certain of his own superiority, but now he understood how wrong he had been. The weight of his disrespect for the veteran, a man who had given everything for others, settled heavily on his shoulders. It was a harsh lesson, one learned too late to undo the damage he had caused. He sat there, the reality of his actions slowly sinking in, and for the first time he truly felt small. In the weeks that followed that fateful day in the diner, the young man found himself unable to shake the memory of his actions. He couldn't stop thinking about the veteran, about the words he had said and how completely wrong he had been. The mocking, the arrogance, the complete lack of understanding, it all haunted him. Every time he tried to go back to his usual routine, something felt off. The world around him felt different now, and it was because of the lesson he had learned too late. He spent the next few weeks reflecting on his behavior, and with each passing day, the weight of his actions grew heavier. He couldn't undo the past, but he could try to make things right. So he decided to make amends. He began volunteering at local veteran events, trying to learn more about the lives of those who had served and sacrificed. At first, it was awkward. He wasn't sure what he could do to truly make a difference, but he kept showing up, determined to do whatever he could. One day, at a local veterans event, he spotted the veteran from the diner. The older man was there, standing quietly among the crowd, his demeanor as calm as ever. The young man's heart skipped a beat as he approached, nervous and unsure of how to even begin. This time there was no arrogance, no sense of superiority, only humility. He took a deep breath, walked up to the veteran, and spoke from the heart. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice shaky. "What I said that day in the diner was wrong. I disrespected you, and I didn't understand what you had been through. I was arrogant, and I'm sorry." The veteran turned to him slowly, his expression unreadable. The young man held his breath, waiting for some sign of anger or rejection, but instead the veteran simply nodded. It wasn't a big gesture, but it was enough. The words he had wanted to say for weeks had finally left his lips, and now the veteran had accepted them without hesitation. The veteran's voice was quiet but steady as he spoke. "We all make mistakes, son. What matters is that you learn from them. I see you're trying, and that's more than most would do." With that, the veteran turned and walked away, leaving the young man standing there, still processing the moment. The apology had been accepted, but the lesson would stay with him forever. Over time, the story of the young man's transformation began to spread throughout the town. People who had once known him as arrogant and dismissive started to notice a change. He was no longer the loud, boastful young man who mocked veterans and lived with a sense of entitlement. Instead, he became someone who understood what it meant to serve others, to give without expecting anything in return. The town, too, began to change. People started to show more respect for their local veterans, not just because they had served, but because they understood the sacrifices those men and women had made. The young man's actions had sparked something in the community, a newfound sense of gratitude and humility. What had begun as a single moment of recklessness had turned into a ripple that spread throughout the entire town. The young man's journey from arrogance to understanding became a local legend, a reminder that it's never too late to change, and that sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that stick with you the longest. The veteran, though he never sought the spotlight, had unknowingly sparked that change. And while the young man's apology had been accepted, it was the veteran's silence, the quiet strength and wisdom he had shown in the face of mockery that had left the most lasting impact on both him and the community. The story reminds us that it's easy to judge or mock others without understanding their past. Yet the universe has a way of teaching lessons, and karma often catches up with those who need it most. The veteran's true strength wasn't just in his service, but in his quiet dignity, his ability to remain calm and let time reveal the truth. In the end, it was his silence, not his words, that taught the greatest lesson: that respect, humility, and understanding are earned, not demanded, and that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that don't speak at all. Thank you for watching this powerful story about respect, humility, and the lessons we learn when we least expect them. It's a reminder that sometimes we don't truly understand the struggles others have faced, and karma always has a way of teaching us what we need to learn. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with your friends. We'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. And if you want to see more inspiring stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Thanks for being part of this journey.